next speaker is Mr. Saul Friedner. He is Associate Director of LS Telcom in the UK, and he has been working with LS Telcom for 6 years. And he has more than 15 years of experience working in spectrum regulations and wireless technology for mixed clients, including regulators, European Commission, and operators worldwide. Saul has spent his early career at the UK regulator Ofcom. So thank you very much, Saul, for accepting also to be here with us today. We are going to hear from him about the socio-economic benefits of IMT versus RLANs in the 6425 to 7125 megahertz band.
Sorry about that. Okay. We're there. Thank you very much. Thank you, Martha. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. My name is Saul Friedner, as already mentioned, and I have the fortunate task, I guess, to talk about the socio-economic benefits of IMT versus RLAN in the 6425 to 7125 band. So, just a quick overview. We were commissioned by the DSA together with our partners VVA, so Italian economic consultancy, to look at the technical benefits and the economic benefits of utilising the band for both Wi-Fi and for IMT. So I'll talk about the scope of the project, what we had to, the objectives, the scenario development. I think it's important to understand, given such a hot topic, I would say, the upper 6 gigahertz band and who eventually will win out kind of globally. So we've had to kind of set some parameters around the study to ensure that we had some key focus and we could come up with some interesting results. So I'll walk through each of those scenarios, and I will also present those some conclusions as well. And hopefully this mic will work throughout the whole presentation. So just in terms of the scope, so this should be familiar to many of you in the audience today. So we are looking at the frequency bands. Okay. Is there a problem? Is it okay? Okay, thank you. So these are the range of services that are currently allocated across the actual 5925 all the way up to 7125 gigahertz band. And you'll see a range of services existing in allocated across fixed, mobile, fixed satellite, and the purpose and scope of the study is to look at the next generation of services that could be utilised in the band. You'll be well aware, given that we are in a European setting within Paris, that there was an EU decision already for the lower portion of the band allocated for Wi-Fi 6E, and I'm sure that was discussed yesterday. But the scope of this study is actually to look at the upper 6 gigahertz portion, in particular an awareness and an appreciation of the studies that are ongoing within in preparation for WRC 23 for an IMT designation in the band, but also the issue around extending Wi-Fi up to the upper limit of the frequency band up to 7125 megahertz. So we were tasked with looking at the scenarios across both IMT and Wi-Fi usage as well. So it was split. The study was split into 3 scenarios. The first scenario examining the licensed IMT usage in the upper 6 gigahertz and making a comparison with the existing allocation of 5G spectrum in the 3.4 to 3.8 gigahertz band. So part of this study was to really conduct a kind of an assessment to actually understand the technical benefits of adding more spectrum for IMT relative to already allocated and assigned spectrum for 5G, so in the 3.4 to 3.8. And this is for licensed nationwide spectrum. So we know that in the 3.4 to 3.8 band, certainly across Europe, many parts of the world, this portion of spectrum has been allocated on a national basis for 5G. In the second scenario, we're looking at local licensed IMT. So these were, as already been mentioned by the first 2 speakers, spectrum that would be used for verticals, smaller sized licensed areas that can be allocated on a kind of exclusive basis for particular verticals and certain industries, but obviously constrained to local areas. And you'll be familiar with allocations already, exclusive allocations in the 3.7 to 3.8 band in Germany, and as just mentioned as well in Brazil. So we're starting to see somewhat pattern for the use of C-band in particular in for local licenses. However, for our scenario, for our study, the comparison was with, let's say, an equivalent portion of spectrum, give or take, 400 megahertz within the C-band. Now, most of you will probably read between the lines here and consider that in the kind of 3.8 to 4.2 range, but we wanted to be a little bit careful around specifying the particular band, but clearly there is already some discussion and kind of agreement that 3.8 to 4.2 is looking like a band that will be used for local licenses for 5G. And then the final scenario was looking at the license-exempt usage, comparing the current lower portion of 500 megahertz versus access to the full 1200 megahertz, and looking at the technical benefits, the additional bandwidth that you'll get by extending the spectrum all the way up to the full limit, versus maybe the limitations, technical limitations and potential economic limitations of only having access to the lower 500 part of the spectrum. So, of course, we had to, apologies for some of the cropped text there, but we had to come up with some technical assumptions. And as we conducted the analysis, we researched a lot of the current papers. Of course, there's work within the ITU, Working Party 5D, that's currently studying the coexistence between IMT and the existing services for the fixed service and fixed satellite service. So we're kind of fortunate enough to already have some pre-existing technical parameters that's been widely debated that we could kind of utilize for some of the technical analysis, in addition to consulting a lot of the existing 3GPP and technical standards to undertake the calculations for the technical benefits. But as an example, so we considered, and again, we had to make some assumptions for this study. So in this band, I think it was reasonable to assume that, that a deployment of small cells in urban areas would be a kind of quite a good assumption, I would say, for the deployment using the upper 6 gigahertz portion. So we conducted an analysis using small cells. But in addition, and as we know within the Working Party 5D discussions, that there are proposals for using macrocells as well. But we've assumed the upper 6 gigahertz would be co-located with the 3.5 gigahertz deployment. So we know that in operators within many countries are deploying their 5G networks today at 3.5, and we would assume that those sites would be upgraded to the upper 6 gigahertz band as well. So although we have calculated the cell ranges for the different frequency bands, and I guess at a very high level kind of free space path loss type calculations, we could assume that the cells using upper 6 gigahertz would be slightly smaller than the cells operating at 3.5 gigahertz. However, with today's technology, certain antenna deployments, there are arguments that the cell ranges could be comparable. You could get equal cell ranges at both bands, depending on the type of deployment that you would get using 3.5 or the upper 6 gigahertz band. We assumed the usage of MIMO as a pretty standard approach to network deployment. So for macrocells in particular, around 64 MIMO. And I don't know if any of you have experienced kind of the using kind of 5G, but certainly MIMO enables the operators to deliver the very high kind of user speeds that we're seeing within the networks. Of course, 5G has the performance targets that have been proposed by the industry, around 100 megabits per second for user throughputs. And again, for those that have had the experience of using 5G, we'll see that, excess of 100 megabits per second can be experienced when on the move using 5G. And then, obviously, to consider as part of our assumptions is the coexistence with the incumbent services. And as I mentioned, there are studies ongoing at the moment to understand how the coexistence with fixed satellite and with the fixed service. but this is still yet to be determined within the WRC conference. With 5G local networks, our kind of broad assumption is that sharing would be possible given the localized nature of the deployments and the ability to, for the regulator to be able to constrain kind of usage to maximize protection to incumbent services. And then based on the studies and the reports that have been produced, certainly within CBT in Europe, we know that coexistence is possible with 6 gigahertz in the Wi-Fi domain. So these are our assumptions. So I'll now go through each of the scenarios. So it's broken down into the kind of the technical, the study was broken into a technical part and then an economic part. And the way we've kind of developed the study and the presentation, so I'll go through each one. So for the first scenario, which is the technical benefits, we calculated the kind of the throughput, if you like, based on the kind of user density. So arguably, the ability to deliver more capacity using, more bandwidth, essentially, the availability of more spectrum that you can get from the upper 6 gigahertz enables the possibility to deliver more bitrate to more users in a population density type environment. So that's how we've come up with a technical benefit to say that yes, with more spectrum, of course, you can deliver more capacity to more users, and hence kind of supporting our assumption that this would be very much a band that would be used for supporting capacity density scenarios. So where there's some congestion in networks in urban areas, this would be useful for kind of easing congestion in that way. So we say there's kind of more capacity, of course, there's more spectrum that's available. The ability to kind of offload traffic, so in those congested areas where usage is quite intense, and based on the assumption that we have existing 3.4 to 3.8 already operating, the addition of this band will, of course, help operators to offload the capacity onto a higher rated band. I think we were also kind of considered that it will be kind of more of a localized nature, which is why we assumed the 2 sub-scenarios, so using small cells as a deployment option, because the fact of the propagation characteristics up at this frequency range doesn't really allow for the very long ranges. And as soon as we start loading these cells with more users, then of course the cells also kind of reduce in size. So this will certainly be a band that could be utilized by the operators to help ease capacity and congestion on their networks. And potentially also offer the ability to support higher rate applications. So, higher rate video, HD, UHD, and so on. So it does deliver potentially that higher level quality of service. But we kept on coming back to the fact that it would be localized and it would be targeting urban areas in particular. In comparison with the 3.4 to 3.8, that band has already been deployed pretty much across the EU, and perhaps I didn't mention it at the beginning, but the focus is actually for Europe. The study was actually looking at Europe, and in fact looking at some of the digital decade targets as well, to help assess how the applications and benefits would flow down by utilising the spectrum. So just to kind of actually mention that. So as already mentioned, the band is already deployed. There is already 400 megahertz of spectrum available in most markets, so it can support for MNO market. It uses 5G, so as I already mentioned, you can already get about 100 megabits per second speeds to mobile consumers. There's an existing ecosystem, and we consider that 3.5 gigahertz by its very nature, from propagation point of view, will deliver better coverage and more suited to kind of wide area networks compared to the upper 6 gigahertz range. So that's just an overview of the technical benefits and the comparison between the 2 bands. So if we look at the economic benefits, and in fact, the most kind of critical aspects really are the costs. And the way we kind of framed this is, as I said, we had the 2 sub-scenarios, one with small cells and one with macro cells. So we calculated a proportion of urban area within the EU. So we took 75 urban cores, and we had some qualifying criteria in our report, which is actually available on the DSA website, as a focus, as a way to kind of narrow down some of the costs. So potentially, if this is a successful band and it does become an IMT band, then it could expand to other areas. So these were our statistics for the number of people that could be served by this band for those living in urban areas, so only 14% of the EU population for this particular example. So we calculated around over 260,000 small cells would be needed to support that many people in those urban cores, and the cost would be around 7.3 billion, based on some assumptions that we had for the deployment of small cells. In contrast, if you were to upgrade macro cells, so existing 3.5 gigahertz macro cells, and again, because these would be upgrades, it wouldn't be new build sites, so it would be in addition to so kind of new equipment and antennas supporting the upper 6 gigahertz band, around 6 billion euros we'd estimate if you were to cover that number of people. So clearly, this could be relatively conservative. This really is about, kind of bit of a stab in the dark, if you like, because it really is an unknown how widely deployed the band would be if it were to become an IMT band in future. But this to give you kind of orders of magnitude. And we did play around with the numbers, and the numbers can ramp up quickly if this was to follow a similar deployment of 3.5 gigahertz. We've seen orders of magnitude greater, certainly for macro cell upgrades. And just to mention about the downstream applications, so as part of the study, we looked at which downstream applications, in addition to, or separate from, I should say, consumers, and those where there would be kind of real enterprise and business benefits that could arise from the use of the spectrum. And what we assumed and what we found, that given that a lot of the sectors that we assessed would really be focused on usage of connectivity indoors, the outdoor macro 6 gigahertz would not really benefit all but one of the actual sectors that we assessed. Agriculture, predominantly being outdoor, I think, or almost all exclusively outdoor, could be a potential application that we found would benefit from the use of the 6 gigahertz band if it were to be deployed IMT. So that was our assumption, our estimate on whether these sectors would really benefit from the deployment of upper 6 gigahertz, separate to the usual consumers. And also just to kind of say that it will effectively address a limited number of those sectors and users is our analysis based on scenario 1. Moving on to scenario 2, which is the local licensed IMT. So from a technical perspective, we found, so again, based on our assumption that there is an alternative option in the 3.8 to 4.2 band for deploying local IMT, we found that actually 6 gigahertz would not be used. We didn't think it would be necessary. We think that there's sufficient amount of spectrum available in an alternative band, given the localized nature, given the ability for the regulator to be able to determine protection of existing users, certainly in the 3.8 to 4.2 band, that this would be adequate for the licensing of local licensing. So in fact, although we did some calculations of different areas like construction, healthcare, manufacturing and so on, we looked at some what we considered to be relatively large areas, although on here kind of 2 square kilometres for the likes of a kind of a port or an airport, even with tens of thousands of users, there is sufficient amount of spectrum if you were able to access the 3.8 to 4.2 gigahertz band. And given the decisions within Europe, this is looking kind of more and more likely and more popular. So although you do get technical benefits, as we just explained for scenario 1, actually, if there is an alternative, if there's an existing band in the 3.8 to 4.2, for example, then we believe that there's sufficient bandwidth available and sufficient access, if you like, to be able to support a lot of the downstream vertical applications that we just discussed. So there is although there are other benefits, we don't think overall that it would be widely utilised or widely deployed. But just to assess from an economic perspective, we did look at around 18,500 campus networks in the EU, so campus sites, if you like, and across the kind of the main sectors that we found three really agriculture, construction, and manufacturing to be the most likely sectors that would use the band. And the likes of manufacturing already mentioned, ports and airports where this band could be utilised. It would give that additional capacity, as I mentioned, so it could be deployed in addition to an existing shared band for local licensing. But as I said, we think that the amount of spectrum that could be made available in this environment would be more than adequate to support the types of applications and uses in these local license environments. But we did calculate the cost of these types of deployments, again, based on some assumptions of deploying smaller networks, 10, 20 base stations in these local sites. And for our 18,500 campus networks came to about 12.35 billion euros for that kind of deployment. So moving on to the kind of final scenario, which now looks at the benefits of going fully license exempt for RLAN and making a comparison between 500 megahertz and the 1200 megahertz. Probably seen these types of stats and facts many times before. This is as I said, a real hot topic that's been discussed in many conferences and meetings over the last couple of years. But I think, I don't think you can perhaps emphasize enough really what the benefits are from going from, say, the 500 megahertz to the 1200 megahertz. And I think, this really, the whole point, I think, is all about access to more spectrum. I mean, that, as much as it seems pretty obvious, but it's the kind of specific additions that you get in terms of what we're calling, extremely high channel benefits and, device frequency support and also the kind of cost differences. And what we've been hearing, and I guess kind of over time, over the last kind of 18 months or so, we have seen more countries adopting the full band, who have clearly seen the benefits of allocating all of the spectrum to the full 6 gigahertz band, the full spectrum band. And I think a lot of it is to do with the ability to get access to more spectrum and the number of different channels. But if I just kind of focusing on the real specific points, is these much wider bandwidths, the ability to access more 160 megahertz wide channels, seven of those, and then 320 megahertz channels. And I think what this does is opens up the opportunity to be future-proofed, to access the new applications that will require and utilise these very wide bandwidths. I think that, kind of say maybe from a personal point of view, it would be a missed opportunity if these bandwidths weren't made available. So as much as there is, say, a strong push from some parts of the industry to kind of see more narrower band channels to increase kind of Wi-Fi capacity, I think there is also a good opportunity here for the innovation argument as well, to adopt, to allow access to these much wider bandwidths, because this hasn't been seen before, in any of the domains, and so would be certainly open up the innovation, allow for innovation to kind of evolve. So just on some of the other issues, clearly access to more spectrum will allow to ease congestion on the other existing Wi-Fi bands in 2.4 and 5 gigahertz, so an overall uplift in the quality of service. And also really just to say that there's been coexistence studies in the lower portion of the 6 gigahertz band that has proven that sharing is possible with incumbents, and of course, making the same assumptions for the upper 6 gigahertz, and clearly that coexistence kind of carries on all the way up to the top of the band. And I think if we didn't mention the final point there, the opportunity for controlled outdoor use as well under the automated frequency coordination type rules, and there are some demos of that here today. So clearly some obvious, I would say, technical benefits between having access to 500 megahertz or the full 1200 megahertz. But I think, of course, understanding the economic benefits, and I think you can see almost instantly from all of the green highlight on our tables, you can see although in terms of the costs, they do outweigh some of the other scenarios, but we actually broke some of the scenarios down into some separate assumptions as well. So in the case of just kind of subscribers having being equipped with the Wi-Fi, just with a standard Wi-Fi 6 router, Wi-Fi 6E router, then kind of as of today, it's around kind of 9.7 billion euros, and then we kind of stepped up our assumptions based on the penetration of broadband, kind of increasing, I guess, over time, and then the kind of the cost based on that. And this is the costs are based on fitting out a new router to support the full 6 gigahertz band. But I think what's quite important also is actually to note the downstream applications that are supported. And as I mentioned for the scenario 1, we developed these scenarios based on kind of feedback where we're seeing outside of kind of consumer benefits, where a lot of the kind of enterprise and businesses would be seeking to adopt either Wi-Fi or IMT. We can see where there's kind of great usage indoors. We can see a lot of the downstream benefits flowing, pretty much as a basic level, kind of a medium level, what we call fitness versus user need, and a lot of the explanation is in our report as to how we make that assessment. But you'll see that even for agriculture, which we consider the majority of outdoor, would also use Wi-Fi in some part of its network, but we very much see education, public services, manufacturing and so on being very high fit for the use of Wi-Fi, and particularly using the full 6 gigahertz band for its applications. The next 2 slides are really just kind of a summary of that, but what I'll do is I'll just kind of it's like repeating myself, but really just to kind of say that kind of broadly speaking, although we identify that there are certainly some technical benefits from a nationwide IMT license in the upper 6 gigahertz, I think the argument about having access to existing spectrum in 3.4 to 3.8, already delivering 5G speeds, indicates that there's already arguably kind of sufficient spectrum to support kind of the current market. Of course, any additional capacity that the mobile operators can access will be will help to ease congestion and deliver some additional quality of service. The additional quality of service, but we see that very much kind of geared towards urban areas and kind of more localized deployments rather than kind of full nationwide deployments. Likewise, with local licensed IMT, we didn't see a benefit for utilizing the upper 6 gigahertz portion at all. We think if a regulator has access to shared spectrum in the C-band, then that would be perfectly sufficient, and there is already an ecosystem and a market emerging in this band already, so there is a bit of a first mover advantage in this band anyway, and it would mean the upper 6 gigahertz band having to catch up, let's say, if it was to be used in that environment. And then, of course, as just already mentioned, the license exempts the benefits of having access to the full 1200 megahertz, supporting innovation, wider channel bandwidths, and kind of helping reduce congestion and being future-proof, I think, are clear for everybody to see. And then lastly, in terms of the economic benefits, the RLAN scenario that we found where majority of the applications predominantly would benefit from indoor usage, clearly the Wi-Fi, access to Wi-Fi indoors, and with the regulatory decisions being made for low power indoor and very low power, clearly aligns well with the different applications that we'd already kind of studied as part of the study. So that's our broad overview of the study. We do have a report, a more comprehensive report, which explains a lot of the high-level stuff that I've just been talking about, and it does go into the detail as to how we came up with the assumptions and the multi-criteria analysis that we did to derive the different applications. So I'll finish there, and thank you very much for your attention.